Welcome to the third module of the 128 plus cars bootcamp. So in the previous two modules, we gave you an overview of what the cars section on the MCAT exam looks like, some general tips and strategies to employ when you are preparing for this section of the exam, and also some more specific strategies, some more tangible things that you can do even outside of practice, such as intentional reading, in order to help boost your critical thinking and reasoning skills. So in this section or this module of the bootcamp, we're going to go into even deeper strategies. And what I mean by that is going in, breaking down, and navigating the question types themselves. And you'll see this a lot in other CARS boot camps and courses as well, by the Princeton Review, by Kaplan, and even by Jack Weston, where they will break down the question types into specific categories and then explain exactly what each of those question types look like and what kind of answers that they're looking for, what kind of reasoning would be best suited to answering each of those question types. And so we're trying to do that as well, but we're going to do it in a more well-rounded and less technical way so that be able to understand exactly what to do and what each of those questions looks like, and helps you to recognize the specific reasoning strategies that you would need to accurately and efficiently complete those questions. So we could skip this part. This is a review from last time as well, an overview of the MCAT exam, the MCAT CARS section, and this is information that was covered in the first module, reviewed in the second module, so we'll just skip this for now. So when it comes to practicing passages in Module 2, we learned how to use intentional reading to supplement our practice. And then we learned exactly how to practice the passages themselves. Number one, by focusing in on your logical justification of both wrong and correct answers or answer choices. And then also reviewing your mistakes to improve your accuracy, and also then to time yourself to improve your speed. So diving a little bit deeper now into how exactly to practice these passages entails learning more about the questions themselves, right? Because as we said before, this is a multiple choice exam, and being able to read and understand and grasp the main idea, the core theme, the author's tone and attitude is all well and good, but at the end of the day, in order for you to do well, it doesn't really matter if you comprehend the passage. Of course, that's indispensable, but strictly speaking, all you need to do is get the most number of questions correct as possible, right? And so it just goes to show that studying the questions themselves can be a big help to improving your performance in your practice, and also ultimately, hopefully, in your MCAT CARS exam as well. So now going forward, we can break down these two categories of questions. We have comprehension questions and reasoning type questions. And so these we classify as broad categories because each of these categories also have, a few subcategories. Right? Each question fits into one of these broad categories, but also their own subcategories within each. And let's first go into the comprehension type questions. So there are three types of comprehension questions, right? These are the subcategories that I was talking about. Number one is the main idea type questions. Number two are the tone and attitude type questions. And number three are the detail or definition type questions, right? The first two types you might have already been familiar with, especially if you've seen our last module there, guiding your background reading or intentional reading with questions about the main idea, being able to summarize the main idea in 1 to 2 sentences, and also about how to recognize the author's tone or attitude towards their subject matter, be it neutral, positive, negative. It's evident from the language and the phrasing that they use, for example, and also if it's a persuasive piece, the stance that they take also goes into what kind of tone or attitude that you'll be able to read from their writing. The third type of comprehension question is the detail or definition type questions, and this we did not go into last time, or if we did, it was probably just touched on, but here we'll go into more detail. No pun intended, but more detail into these types of questions. So again, just maybe a quick review then for the main idea questions, right? They will ask about the primary topic of the passage, the main idea, or the core theme of the passage, right? And if you've been skimming your passages, taking the first 2 to 3 minutes to quickly read from beginning to end, and then guiding that reading with questions in your head, you're already thinking about what is the main idea of this passage, right? And how can I summarize this in 1 or 2 sentences and make it as concise and to the point as possible, right? And so these questions, if you're excelling at that type of reading already, then these questions should not be a problem for you, right? They should be a breeze. But just to reiterate that, again, I cannot emphasize this strategy enough that you should summarize or try to summarize the main idea of a passage from that first read through, right? Taking that 2 to 3 minutes to read through the whole thing, because you read through the whole thing, you're going to get an overall idea of what the passage is about, right? So you don't want to have to go back and read the whole thing again, because that wastes time during your actual test, right? Even during your practice runs as well. And so summarizing the main idea is very, very important, and they will 100% of the time just give you the answer to those main idea questions, right? And how main idea questions are worded, you'll realize when you go through a practice passage or a practice set of problems, is that they will actually use these words, right? They'll use the words primary topic, right? The question might literally say, what is the primary topic of this passage, right? It's not meant to be ambiguous. It's not meant to be a trick question. And as long as you grasp what it is on that first read through your 1 to 2 sentence summary, these questions should not be a problem for you, right? And other ways that the question could ask is, what is the main idea, or what is the theme of this passage, right? There's no trick wording there. They're not trying to, trip you up with what it is that they're looking for. Main idea questions are usually very straightforward in the way that they're asked. Next, the tone or attitude questions. They will ask about the author's stance and purpose on whatever topic it is that the passage is on. And last module, we talked about asking whether or not a certain passage is a persuasive piece, right? And a persuasive piece is whether it's like if the topic is a contentious topic or is a debatable topic, right? The author could be trying to sway the reader to take a certain stance, right? In a debate, you either have the pro side or the con side, for example, and the passage, depending on what the author's stance is, will communicate that one way or the other, right? And so that's what a persuasive passage would look like. Persuasive passages are also very evident in the tone and attitude of the author, right? Depending, again, on their language, the phrasing, whether or not when you read it, you feel that they are communicating their ideas in a humorous manner, in a sarcastic manner, in an informative manner, acerbic manner. All of these words that are used to describe tone and attitude, right? And this is something that you could get through the language and phrasing, but there's a good amount of it that is also comes down to how you feel about the passage when you read it, right? And more important, how you think that the author feels about the topic that they're discussing. So again, reiterating that strategy is to take your time and analyze the author's language and phrasing, right? That can really help you if you don't already have that natural feel about the tone or the subject or the author's stance on the subject, right? Looking for words like that describe that looking for words that the author is using to describe certain aspects or to present their arguments, like it is very important, or it is crucial. That's something, right? Makes it feel like the author is in very strong support of something, right? Or if they're using sarcastic language or irony, you could also pick up on that as well. And that goes into your understanding of the author's language, the author's tone and attitude, right? It's a little bit difficult trying to explain or give examples off the top of one's head, but in the next module, we'll be able to go through a few sample passages, and through those examples, we'll be able to show you how the tone comes through in each of those passages, right? Because they are passage specific. But this is just a general overview on how to answer these tone/attitude type questions. The third type of comprehension questions is the detailed definition questions, right? These are relatively straightforward because they will ask about specific information and context of words and sentences and lines in the passage, right? They'll say something like, in line 27, what is the meaning of the word yada, 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 right? Or in paragraph 2, what does the author mean when he says this? Or what is being communicated when the author uses this in this example, right? And so they tell you where it is in the passage, which paragraph, which line, what word, which sentence, and all you really have to do is to return to the specific line in the context, reread it, also read the sentence that comes immediately before it, and the sentence that comes immediately after it for added context, and then you should be able to answer this question no problem, right? So out of all the comprehension type questions, the main idea, the tone attitude, and the detailed definition questions, we believe that the detailed definition detailed questions are the most straightforward to answer, because all you have to do is return to the text and then identify where it is that they're asking, and just pull that evidence, pull that answer directly from the text and put it in, right? The tone attitude questions, as I said, are a lot more nuanced, right? And hopefully in the next module where we show you or we guide you through reading and answering questions on a passage, on a sample passage, how to tackle those questions become a little bit more clear. And the main idea type questions, remember, you can answer those by summarizing that main idea, that core theme, in your own words in 1 to 2 sentences after your first read through. So those are 3 strategies now we've presented that are tangible things that you could do in your practice sets in order to practice and improve your critical reading and reasoning skills so that you can get a higher score on your CARS section. Next, let's talk about the reasoning type questions. So these are the more nuanced of the 2 broad categories, right? Comprehension means pulling evidence directly from the text, but reasoning is more abstract, right? These types of questions have to do with what you think the passage is saying. They require you to read between the lines, so to speak. So they're a little bit more challenging, but not to worry. We'll go through them, the subcategories of the reasoning type questions one by one, and present an overarching strategy to answer these types of questions. And again, there are 4 types of reasoning questions, right? Compared to 3 comprehension questions or comprehension type questions. There are 4 types of reasoning questions. Number 1, the inference type question. Number 2, the function type questions, the application type questions, and then you have your support/detract type questions. Right, and as I mentioned previously, these reasoning type questions are not as straightforward to answer as the comprehension type questions, right? And so we don't really have specific strategies for each type of these questions, but there's an overarching strategy that you could use that I will present after going through what each of these 4 subcategories of reasoning type questions look like. So let's get into it. So inference questions will ask about what the passage assumes or suggests. And a lot of the times, how these questions are worded are also non-ambiguous, right? Like that main idea type question. They'll literally just straight up say, this passage assumes that. And then they'll give you that list of answer choices, or what does this passage suggest about something. And then they'll give you a list of your answer options, right? So again, these types of questions are rarely meant to trip you up, right? These 2 keywords, assumes or suggests, will literally appear in the question stem themselves most of the time. And so when you see that, you'll know that it's an inference type question, and you'll know how to answer it or what kind of reasoning to employ. Next, we've got the function type questions, right? They will ask about the purpose or relationship of a specific element in the passage to another element in the passage or to the passage as a whole, right? Questions like this will say something like, going back to paragraph 2, for example, the quote by a specific writer or a specific philosopher, how does that quote relate to the argument in the next paragraph about something? Or how does a certain argument in a certain paragraph relate to the message of the passage as a whole, right? So that's what a function type question would look like. They're asking about the function or the purpose of specific elements in the text to each other or to the passage as a whole, right? So you got to be able to understand why certain pieces of evidence are being used in the passage and what kind of value they bring to the merits, to the literary merits of that passage. Next, application type questions will ask you to use passage elements to inform new contexts or hypotheticals, right? These types of questions usually ask something like along the lines of, based on the information in the passage, which of the following would the author most likely agree with? Or which of the following would the author least likely agree with? Or they might give you a bunch of hypothetical arguments that were not presented in the passage, and then ask you which of those would the author most likely use to supplement their writing, their passage, right? Or which of those hypothetical arguments would weaken the author's stance in the passage, right? Something like that, right? And so application questions, and you'll see also the next type, the strengthen, detract, or support detract type questions are very similar. They overlap a little bit, right? But those are the types of wordings that you should be on the lookout for, right? And then if you recognize that as an application type question, then that makes your job on how to answer them and what kind of reasoning to use a lot more simpler. So we just mentioned a little bit about this, the support detract type questions, right? They're related to that application type as well. They might ask you to identify potential arguments that are in text, that certain evidence also in text supports or weakens, right? So this also kind of relates back to that function type question as well, right? They'll ask you about argument 1 or argument 2 presented in paragraphs 1 and 2 of a certain passage, and then ask you to identify certain pieces of evidence also in the passage elsewhere that supports these arguments, right? Another type of support detract question may ask you to identify evidence that supports or weakens an argument, right? So here in the first type, we said that you're going to identify potential arguments that in text evidence supports or weakens. This is the vice versa of that. It asks you to identify evidence that supports or weakens a certain argument, right? I believe I sort of mixed it up there in between, but this is the type of questions that they'll give you, right, pieces of arguments in the passage, right, in paragraph 1 or 2, and then ask you to identify certain evidence also in the text that supports those arguments, right? And in this previous type of support detract question, it was actually, you could think of it as the other way around, where they give you specific evidences in the text and then ask you about what arguments that are also presented in the text that evidence supports or weakens. The third type of support detract question might ask you how new evidence, so evidence that's not been mentioned in the text, that's beyond the text, might support or weaken an argument, right? So these types of questions, they'll present 4 new pieces of information or 4 new facts as a part of their answer options. Ask which of the following supports or weakens a certain argument presented in the passage. So those are the 4 types of reasoning questions, and now that we've gone through what all of them might look like, here is a list of strategies or steps that you can take in order to answer them, right? So number 1 is to read between the lines. This might sound a little vague, but what that essentially means is, again, to not take everything at face value in the passage, right? Those words and those phrases, they have hidden meanings, they have connotations beyond what they appear to just say on the surface, right? And this goes back also into that tone attitude type comprehension question, because the tone you're not going to be able to get from the words, right, themselves. It's more how the author uses them. It's more how the author uses certain words or phrases to communicate their arguments or to communicate their stance, right? And it goes back into the idea of identifying whether the author is trying to be humorous about the topic that they're talking about, or is trying to be sarcastic, or is trying to be, wholehearted about it, trying to be genuine or authentic about it. All those things, they're not explained or they're not laid out to you right in the words themselves, but there's things that happen between the lines, right? I'm sure since a lot of you have completed high school English courses, reading between the lines sort of means something to you, right? And that's exactly what I'm trying to get at. Reading between the lines will help you to get more nuanced information from the passage that will help you answer those types of questions, and also all 4 of the reasoning type questions as well. All of those require a full understanding of where the author is coming from and what they're thinking about when they're making their arguments. Number 2 is to simplify or rephrase the question, right? If a question sounds convoluted, it doesn't have to stay that way. You could look at that question, reread it, and then try to sub in words here or there that make the question a little bit simpler to understand, right? Rephrase the question in your own words. That often helps you with understanding exactly what it is the question is asking for. A lot of the time, students get tripped up over the complexity of the question itself, right? The question could be a very long-winded question, provide you with a bunch of red herrings, or lead you astray with their wording. But if you focus on the core or the crux of the question and then simplifying and rephrasing that into exactly what it is that you think the question is asking, that will make you, when you explore the answer options later on, your life a lot simpler, right? And the third step is to formulate your best answer. And your is highlighted in red here because that's what we mean, your best answer. Not which of the 4 answer options are the best, but discounting all of them, right? Not even looking at those 4 answer choices. What do you think the answer to that question is, right? You have to have some idea, right? It doesn't matter how vague or how half-baked that idea is, you're going to have some idea of what that question is looking for. And it simply comes from a natural consequence of simplifying or rephrasing the question, right? Because you did that work, you're going to have your own expected answer to that question, right? So formulate your best answer. To the best of your ability, it doesn't have to be, like I said, the best worded answer out there, right? It doesn't have to read very, very well. But as long as you in your head know what it is that you're trying to get at with your answer, that's sufficient. So formulate your best answer. And then only after that, do you recommend you to go and look at the answer options or the answer choices themselves. And then when you do, you're not trying to find the right answer per se, but you're more so trying to evaluate each of those answer options and seeing how well they match with your best answer, right? And again, these steps, they help a little bit with that tone, attitude, comprehension type question, right? But where this workflow really shines through is when you're trying to tackle those more nuanced reasoning type questions, right? And so evaluating the best answer out of the 4 answer choices that they give you would be the way to go, right? You're not looking for the right answer. You're evaluating each answer and seeing how well they match with the answer that you came up with yourself. And that leads us into the next step. Choose the answer option that's closest to your best answer, right? Most of the time, that would be the correct one, or it would come really close to being correct, right? And we talk about this a lot of the time, and you'll see on forums, also in other bootcamp courses as well, that they tell you, or they talk about something called your gut feeling, right? And a lot of the times, they say, go with your gut feeling. And when they say that, they're usually talking about, when you're running out of time or when you're scrambling and you're trying to pick between like the 2 answer choices that you've eliminated, the other 2 obviously wrong ones, then you're now stuck between 2 equally likely answer choices. And they tell you to go with your gut because your gut choice would most likely, probably be the right one, right? So it's not exactly a 50-50 chance. It might be more of a 60-40 chance, right? If you go with your gut. But this way of using your gut feeling is a lot more structured, right? There's a lot more evidence that goes into it. So you can be a lot more confident in your gut feeling because you've gone through reading between the lines, because you've rephrased the question, and because you've formulated your own answer and then also evaluated the best or evaluated all the answer options. Now where you're choosing the one closest to your answer. And if you're finding yourself stuck between 2 equally appealing choices, then now if you go with your gut feeling, I would say that the likelihood of getting the right one now goes up even from 60-40 to maybe 70-30 or maybe even 80-20, right? Because you've gone through and done all the work beforehand, right? Reading, simplifying, formulating, and evaluating. Now when you go with your gut feeling, you can be a lot more confident that the one that you choose is the right one. And also you have that feeling of, okay, this one is close to my answer, right? This one is close to the answer that you yourself formulated. So there's also that added benefit of confidence as well. And last but not least, if you take longer than 10 or 15 seconds to answer a question, right, it's really giving you trouble, just flag it and move on, right? So don't spend a minute and a half laboring over one question, because as we mentioned before in the previous module, you want to be able to answer as many questions right as possible. And so you're doing yourself a disservice if you're taking time away from the next couple of questions in the set. And those questions might be a lot easier and you might get them a lot faster, right? And on the test, every single question is worth the same number of points. They're not going to give you extra points if you get a difficult question, right, compared to an easier one. And so that's why you should flag and move on from a question if it takes you too long to complete. That is not to say that you should never return to your flag questions, right? At the end of each passage, hopefully you'll have maybe 1 or 2 minutes, or maybe conservatively speaking, a minute and a half, to go back and review your answer, right? At the end of each passage. And this is important. So at the end of each passage, you want to return to the flag questions for that passage and then try to figure out if you can get some extra information or some alternate line of reasoning to help you arrive at an answer that you feel confident about, right? And the reason why you do that at the end of each passage is because after you finish that passage and all the questions associated with it, that passage is still fresh in your mind, right? And so the answer that you'll come up with when you're returning at the end of each passage will probably be more correct than if you just leave every single flag question until the end of your entire test, right? Because that passage, each passage will stay fresh in your mind for the duration that you're spending on it. When you move on to the next passage, then your mind necessarily takes that passage that you just read and puts it in the back seat, right? And you don't remember as much about it later on in the test, right? You want to be returning to your flag questions when that passage is still fresh and you're still in that zone of reasoning for that specific passage. And the very last tip that we have is to not return to questions for previous passages. This is the same kind of similar piece of advice, just in a different vein, but do not return to questions for previous passages unless you have time at the very end. Say you finish passage 1, right? And you flagged a few. At the end of passage 1, you go back and you try to do all the flagged ones, right? And then you move on to passage 2. You take passage 1, you put it out of your head. Now you focus on passage 2. You do the same thing, right? You flag questions that you don't know the answer to in less than 15 seconds. And then at the end of passage 2, you return to those questions. And then again for 3 and for 4. And each time you move on to the next passage, you put the previous passage out of your mind, right? Because you need all that mental headspace in order to focus on the passage at hand. At the end of the test, after you've completed all 9 passages, hopefully you shouldn't have any flagged questions left because you would have taken care of that passage by passage. But if you still do, right? If you try to go back to the flag questions at the end of passage 3, for example, the question that you flagged for passage 3, you go back and you think about it, you try to reason, and you still can't get it, right? You still feel doubtful. Just leave that and go on to passage 4, right? Your 9 minutes are up for that passage that you've allotted yourself. Move on to the next passage, right? And at the end of the entire test, after you finish all 9 passages in that section, right, in the car section, then if you have any outstanding flag questions, now you have that extra 5 minutes at the end, or 4 minutes, or however much time to return to those questions. And again, you shouldn't have too many of those because hopefully you should have taken care of the flagged questions passage by passage already. So maybe you'll only have to go back to just 2 or 3 questions that really gave you trouble, right? And if you don't have time at the end of your 9 passages, your car section, to return to those questions, no harm, no foul, right? you could either just go back to them and just make a wild guess. Sometimes you've eliminated 2 of the answer options, and so that even that guess would be 50-50, so it's not a bad chance. Or if you really don't have time and you just miss those 2 or 3 questions completely, right? Even if you leave them blank, that's not the worst that could happen, right? It's only 2 or 3 questions out of a total of 54, because you've taken that time at the end of each passage to go back and review the flag questions for that passage specifically. Right? And so if you follow these steps, you guarantee that you will see a major improvement in your CARS score. And again, we here at Flourish Institute are here to help. So register for our community if you haven't already done so, to connect with like-minded individuals and students who are also preparing for this test, and also to connect with experienced tutors who want nothing more than to help you achieve your goals to the best of your potential.